Hey guys, my name's Christian Sparks. You may know me online as Hippo Wombat. Recently, I released my product, Orbit Weather and Seasons Suite for Unreal Engine 4. It is a time of day weather and season simulation blueprint available for Unreal Engine 4.12 and 4.13, both on the Unreal Engine Marketplace and on Gumroad for $19.99. Today, I'm going to be going over the first of a few instructional tutorials. This one is going to be covering the clouds. Let's get started. So as you can see right here, we have just some static clouds set up in the scene. These are found in the backdrop clouds section. You can toggle these on or off with this backdrop active parameter. And there are a few starter choices available for you in terms of the style that you have. We have cumulonimbus, cirrus, or cirrocumulus. With the backdrop clouds, you can set the height, so how high or low the backdrop clouds will be in your sky. You can set the scale, so how large or small the backdrop sheet will be. The opacity, so how opaque or opaque, whichever it is, your clouds are. And the brightness, how much they light up your sky. You can also set up a rotation rate down here at the bottom. As well as a rotation, and you can set the color of these clouds. Now you may notice when I'm dragging this color value around, it's not changing the value. I will show you why in just a moment. That basically covers the backdrop clouds. They're very simple. They're just kind of a static object, just to add another layer of clouds in the sky. Moving on from the backdrop clouds, we have the stratus clouds. These are the dynamic storm clouds that roll in, roll out, shape, break apart, and join together. And I will turn these on now so that you can see what they look like. Now, I have loaded in a weather profile. If you scroll down here to the bottom, there are weather patterns, that you can load. I loaded the lightly cloudy pattern just as a jumping off point for this. So going through these parameters, the first one that we have is the cloud sample quality. I can change this, but it's not really going to show a whole lot of difference. And the reason is that the clouds currently are set to a pretty low fluffiness value. So the higher the fluffiness is, the more depth and shape and volume that the clouds are going to have. So right now, by default, it's set to 15. I'm going to bump this up to 100 just to really accentuate the difference. So if you keep an eye on the clouds when I hit enter now, you can see that there is a lot more depth and shape to them. This is because the clouds use a slice-based volumetric technique, and the higher your fluffiness value is, the more spaced apart each vertical slice is, and so the more space and volume shape that you get. There's a bit of a relationship between the fluffiness value and the sampling quality. The sampling quality is going to increase the number of sample layers that are visible on screen, so you can get away with stretching out layers even further without seeing artifacting. But if I just keep these settings at medium and bump the fluffiness all the way up to 300, you can see, if I zoom in, that there is some artifacting going on with the slices. So if I were to bring up the sample quality to very high, it's not as noticeable. It's still there, but it's not as noticeable. 300 is a pretty high value. I included it just for the sake of having it in there, because I wanted to keep this as customizable as a product as possible. And if you want to go even higher, you can get into the blueprint and unlock that max value. For now, I'm going to keep it down to 150. And I'm going to drop my sample quality back down to medium. Now, traditionally, when you look at game quality settings, you want to go for ultra, obviously. in this case, medium really is going to give you a lot of visual fidelity, a lot of depth, without sacrificing too much performance. You can go with the high or very high sample qualities. However, you're going to see a performance drop due to the way that the translucent layers are stacking on top of each other. It's just the way that the combination of forward rendering with the translucent layers combining into the deferred rendering that Unreal Engine uses by default. I am exploring some more forward rendering options to see if I can save on performance, as well as some other cloud rendering techniques that may offer even more depth than I already have, as well as better performance. Those will be in later updates, so keep an eye out for videos on that, as well as the updates themselves. Anyway, you may notice when I change the cloud sampling settings that it looks like the cloud self shading changes, and it does and it doesn't. If I move it back to medium, I'm going to take a look at a value called the cloud backlighting exponent. This value is going to control on a gradient along the z-axis how much the clouds are self-shadowing. So if I lower this value a little bit here, you'll start seeing those shadows creeping up further along the z-axis of the clouds, whereas if I move it up, it decreases that value, or decreases the shading, excuse me. So it's good to find a little bit of a middle ground. We'll drop it at about 0.89 for now. That way that there's some self-shadowing along the bottom, but the thinner areas and the higher up areas aren't going to be self-shadowed as much. Again, you can change this to whatever you want. The system is customizable as possible. The issue, of course, is that when you change the sampling settings, more sample layers are being added in, and so you have to kind of essentially reconcile for the extra layers that are now being shaded or not shaded, depending on your backlighting exponent. We have a couple other options here. You have height, so you can bring the volumes, the clouds up and down. You can do the shape fall off. So if I'm going to drop down here real quick to the wind section and turn off directional wind for the clouds. If you see the shape fall off, let me jump up here real quick to where the clouds are. So you'll see with the shape fall off, when I adjust it, it controls how much along the z-axis it contrasts to the texture is being applied, which effectively tapers off the texture. So by default, if you don't taper the texture at all, if you were to see my hand as an example, it would just stack and stack and stack and stack and essentially be a flat stack of hands. But instead, if my hand were a cloud, as you move up higher, my hand would shrink, giving it like a tapered effect to give the clouds a little bit more shape. You can control that shaping there. So, in addition to that, we have the cloud lighting intensity, which is the overall brightness of the clouds themselves, how much light they're allowing to pass through and be lit. So you can change the cloud lighting intensity to be even brighter, which is going to blow up your screen, or you can lower it to give it much more of a subtle look. It's ultimately up to you. The default value is 35. Depending on your post-processing settings with your auto exposure and your bloom, that may or may not mess with it. Moving along, cloud lighting intensity. Okay, so the backlighting fall off, so that tapered gradient, or that gradient, excuse me, along the z-axis that controls how much the cloud shading, or the clouds are self-shadowing. You can control the contrast of that taper to make it sharper or smoother using the cloud backlighting fall off. And it's kind of, if I set it to like 0 or something like that, and then move the backlighting exponent around, you can see it really chops in those shadows, versus if I bring it back up to that 20,000 value, it's much smoother. Cloud night max darkness. So if I scroll down to the time of day section and bring everything to a nighttime setting, you can control, and this will change depending on if you scale the cloud height, the cloud sampling quality. So again, you need to adjust for this. It's kind of a setback of having everything be so customizable, is that things rely on each other a bit. So you can scroll back up here and do your cloud night max darkness, and you can control how dark or not dark those clouds are at night. Bump it back to around 12 noon-ish. Scroll back up here. And then the cloud density. So this is going to be how dense the texture is upon itself. So how much or not much, many or not many, gaps form between the clouds. So you can control that with this value here, and you can see the clouds forming, building together, and then eventually closing in. So you can, as an option for automation, you can let the clouds change density at runtime. You can change how often the cloud density changes will occur, and it'll essentially pick a number between 0 and 1 on the cloud density scale, and it will apply that, and then it will interpolate that value smoothly to it without chopping or anything like that, so it does happen smoothly. The cloud opacity is how opaque or opaque the clouds are, because they are using translucency, so you can control that. You can really get some softer looking clouds if you bring that value down, or you can really get some solid looking pieces by bringing that value back up. The cloud sheet scale, so again, those translucent layers are being stacked for that volume effect. You can scale the XY, or just how long and wide the sheet is, using this cloud sheet scale. So it's much smaller now, or if I bring it all the way out, it stretches it out across the visible area. That's really a good value to play with depending on the size of the level that you're using or the world space that you're using. However, you'll notice if I bring this volume way up, it makes it look like the clouds are A, really low, and B, really huge and uncontrollably large. That's okay. You can change the actual texture scale, because the clouds are generated from a noise texture inputted here. You can control the scale of the mapping for that, just like that. Another thing to look at when you're messing with those values is the cloud dissolve exponent. So that is the mapping for that noise texture that breaks away the clouds, and so you'll want to scale that with your cloud. So if I set it to really low, you can see the breakaway is very small, but as I increase it, it changes the way that the clouds are going to look and break apart. Bring those back to their defaults. The cloud wind exponent is going to, sorry, hang on one second here, the cloud shadow pattern scale. So the cloud self-shadowing, again, is generated from that noise, just so that it's not a solid dark color. You can control the scaling of the texture mapping for that across it by using this cloud shadow pattern scale. So if I bring that backlighting exponent down so that there's a lot of shading, and bring that cloud density up, I can mess with that cloud shadow pattern scale to control the cloud shadow pattern scale, essentially. Okay. The cloud wind exponent is going to control how strongly the values from the wind section affect the main cloud texture generation. So the main cloud bodies, how much they're affected by the wind north-south and east and west values. Same goes for the cloud dissipation wind molt. It does the same thing for the cloud dissolve exponent texture that's generated there. The cloud cast shadows render distance. So this is used, you have to apply a light function to get cloud shadows working. So real quick here, I am going to save what I'm doing and build what I'm doing, and I'm just going to generate a, by the way, real quick here, let me cover this. If you go to build and you get this error, large actor receives a pre-shadow, large actor receives a pre-shadow, blah, 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 blah. Those are from the frustum meshes for the volumetric lighting. They have to receive dynamic shadows unless you're using baked lighting, which I highly recommend using dynamic lighting over baked lighting in this system. It is intended for dynamic lighting. You can get around it and use baked lighting if you want, and I will create a tutorial video for that in the future. However, I strongly recommend for this system to utilize dynamic lighting. I realize that's a bit more expensive, but it's what the system was built for. Anyway. So to set up cloud shadows, to visualize this, I'm going to create a blank landscape. Fill world, create. Okay. So, whoops. I'm going to back up here so that we can see the landscape. And you'll see this, you know, the sheets having a cutoff in the distance. That's because they are built from just a mesh. It's a good idea to, you know, hide the edges if you're using an open world map like that. You know, you can use like an ocean to hide these edges. You can use distant mountains, stuff like that. That's really more of a level design suggestion, but it's carries through for this situation particularly. So to set up cloud shadows, you'll need to assign a light function that I've included with the system. So under the orbit folder in materials, you'll want to utilize mCloud shadows. Okay, so this doesn't look right away. That's okay. There's a little bit of tweaking that we have to do, and you'll want to do the same thing for the moon if you want cloud shadows for your moon. So for the sun, we'll want to drag this out a bit so that you can see these values a little bit better. Change the light function scale. So if I bring it up to 10,000, it scales it a little bit better. If I bring it up to 100,000, it scales it up a little too far. So it's really about playing with those values. The light function is not going to match the texture projection along the clouds perfectly, but it does simulate the cloud shadows. Moving back to orbit, we have the cloud cast shadows render distance. So this is how far away from the camera the cloud shadows using that material function are going to be visible. The cloud shadow power is going to control the contrast of those cloud shadows. So if you bring it, it's really sharp. Bring it back, it's not. And you bring that out into the distance. So I'm going to try and scale the cloud shadow pattern to just match a little bit better along those cloud shadows that are being cast. Somewhere around right there. Again, it's not going to match perfectly. In the future, again, looking at different cloud rendering techniques, I'd like to have clouds that cast actual shadows from themselves, but given the expense of the translucency layering, the clouds use actually an unlit shader model. All of the shading that you see in the clouds themselves are actually simulated through math that I set up in the shader. As a result, they don't actually cast shadows or translucent shadows themselves. Something that I'm looking into for a future update. So, moving forward, we have some values to dictate how other sources interact with the clouds, light sources specifically. So if I bring this backlighting exponent down a little bit, so there's a little bit more shading, and I bring the cloud lighting intensity down a bit, you'll notice as I tweak this value on this side over here, the lighting will change. This side over here, it won't as much. Cloud lighting intensity. Now the reason for that is that in this cloud, this unlit cloud material, there's actually set up for the sun to backlight the clouds. So if I bring this cloud, where is it? Cloud lighting intensity value down, and then I move the time slider, you can see along those top layers of the clouds that aren't being self-shaded, there's actually backlighting occurring from the sun. Now you can control the radius of that backlighting, how deep down from the top into the clouds the backlighting occurs. Let me show you how to do that. So the sunlighting fall off is going to be the contrast of that. It's essentially a sphere mask bringing in that sunlighting. So you can control the contrast of it by tweaking this value. It's not really going to be super noticeable, but if I do the sunlighting intensity and bring that up, you can see that the backlighting is getting much, much brighter along those areas. Or if I bring it down, it takes that effect away. The sun backlighting radius, also I think it's just called the sunlighting radius, but it is the sun backlighting radius. You bring that value up and it's going to increase the distance that the clouds from a central point, which is where the sun is hitting the clouds, are going to hit. So if I bring that down to 0, it takes the effect away, but I can expand it outwards. And the sun backlighting offset is going to be that value, how deep into the cloud that light is injected. So if I bring this volume down, it goes further down along the clouds, but if I bring it up, it's more towards the top. The same effects for interaction from outside objects can be applied to the moon backlighting as well as the lightning backlighting. I'll go over moon and lightning setup in another video. Finally, we have the cloud colors. We have light and dark based on the clouds texturing, texture generation rather. But if you'll notice, it's not changing any values if I change either of these. The reason for that, and the reason that I couldn't change the backdrop cloud color earlier in the video, is because by default the clouds are set to pull their color values from curve float or curves, curve assets based on the sun's position in the sky. So you can find those curves under materials, curves, and they're all listed right here. If you're familiar with editing color or float curves, you can change the values based on the time of day there. It is more of an advanced option, but it is there available for you if you'd prefer. So if I uncheck this box here, the colors are going to be formed based on the color choices that you choose. So if I change these colors, it's going to change the upper non-shaded areas of the clouds versus the dark colors down here at the bottom, and those are really desaturated, so it's kind of harder to see, but there we go. You can see those shadowed colors a little bit better. Same goes with the if I disable the stratus clouds, I can change the values of these backdrop clouds so that the color changes are visible. Go ahead and set that back to just based on time of day. I think that pretty much covers everything in the clouds section. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, considerations, suggestions, or if you just want to say hi, go ahead and leave me a comment below. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so that you can get the latest updates and tutorials on how to use Orbit. And thank you so much for your feedback and support. I really appreciate it. More updates coming. Bug fixes coming first with the launch, but I will see you next time. Thanks.